Today we're going to be talking about federalism versus anti-federalism. Last time we saw the sequence of events that led us to the Declaration of Independence, eventually to breaking from England and becoming a sovereign separate nation. I want us to think about one of the first really central things in which the founding fathers of the founding generation really began to disagree about. You'll notice probably when you hear the news or hear people talk about the founding of the United States that people talk about the founding fathers as if they are a unified group of people who agreed on everything and had a very particular vision for what the United States should be, and nothing could be further from the truth. These were very different people with different backgrounds who wanted different things. Some of them were more secular, rationalist thinkers who didn't believe in traditional Christianity. Others thought that Christianity should undergird the entire future of the nation. Some people thought there should be a very strong, large central government. Other people thought that the states should essentially keep their sovereign control over their local autonomy. Others believed that a strong federal government would compromise the individual rights of American citizens, and so they would reject a strong federal government. This is really one of the things that divided many of the early founding fathers. So I want us to think about some of the ideas that we've went over in this class. If you remember that Enlightenment influence that we saw begin to happen on colonial society, there was this notion that people aren't necessarily fundamentally broken, right? That they can, if they are taught right, educated properly, then they will be able to become good citizens. And if you remember that kind of goes all the way back to a Greco-Roman kind of understanding about civic virtue, right? So if we use this word Republican, small r, not the big Republican Party as we think of the way Republican, that word is used today, small r Republicanism concerns itself with what does it mean to be a good citizen? What does it mean to create a representative government that to some degree or another is democratic? And if you remember, there is this focus on virtue or citizenship. So I'll list a couple of major points that Republican ideology adhered to, some central points that people who believed in Republicanism would all probably agree on. A couple of points in this founding generation really kind of come to the forefront. One is this notion of civic virtue, or that it is good for you to be devoted to the larger whole of society. Two is the notion that we should overcome self-interest. Self-interest is the enemy. If you can't put your own self-interest away to put the interest or the good of the whole above your own interest, then you are not capable of being a proper citizen. Also, many of the founding generation believed that in order for a Republican democratic society to last or to persist, that essentially they would have to be more often than not homogenous. Society should sort of look the same. If things become too diverse, then they would eventually break apart. And this, when we begin to move through the 1960s and future lessons and into the present, we'll see how that will kind of define many of the conversations that we have about diversity today. Number four, I think there is this high vision of human nature. And if you remember going back to John Locke, there's this notion that we come into the world blank slates, and therefore that means if we're educated properly, if we're raised in a decent environment, then we will become good citizens. You can see how this can become elitist very quickly, right? So although there is a high view of human nature, the idea that we are all equal or come into the world the same way, for a lot of these founding generation, it doesn't mean that people stay equal, right? Or it's only people who do have, say, a good education, they're raised properly, the implications here. The idea here is that if you weren't raised right, educated right, brought up right, if you aren't independently wealthy in some sense, if you don't own property, therefore you have some stability, therefore you are not able to make good decisions for the whole. So very quickly you can see how in the early republic there are these property qualifications where if you're not independent in some sense, then they believe you're not able to put your interests above the rest. If you have to go to work and you're living paycheck to paycheck, then you're not able to actually step out and say things that need to be said, or put others' interests above your own. You're not able to be objective enough, is their perspective. So you can see how it becomes very elite very quick. And this will give us kind of this split that begins to happen for people who are all sympathetic to the Republican notion of human nature, of civic virtue, but they begin to disagree on how this might play out in practice. And so there's going to be this split between an idea that educated, wealthy elite should rule society, should make the best decisions, should oversee the rest of society, with this other notion that really every common person should have more democratic access to the political process. This last difference will really begin to divide many of the founding fathers from Federalist versus Anti-Federalist tendencies. To give a clear insight into this, let's see what John Adams, our second president and strong Federalist leader of the early republic, said about democracy. According to John Adams, democracy, while it lasts, is more bloody than either aristocracy or monarchy. Remember, democracy never lasts long. It wastes, exhausts, murders itself. There's never a democracy that did not commit suicide. So we can see how early Federalists begin to have a more critical view of unlimited democracy. When the Second Continental Congress, when the groups of states begin to come together and meet in order to create a unified front, first against the British, and then after that as an independent nation, they were met with a number of troubles. Initially, they were a war government. They could only do certain things like conduct war, sign treaties, appoint ambassadors. They could appoint generals, declare independence in 1776. But they had to rely on the states for soldiers, money, supplies. There wasn't this overarching federal government that could coerce the states into doing what they needed to do. And a lot of the states were very suspicious of anything that looks like that. So from 1781 to 1789, for almost a decade, the United States were unified by Articles of Confederation. And so if we think about later that word confederacy or confederation, this is essentially what the first federal government of the United States was. It was a coming together in order to have a unified front against some outside enemy or to accomplish some goal, but it wasn't a coherent federal government. So there was no executive, there was no president, there was no Supreme Court that could adjudicate between differences between states. There was essentially a one vote for each state that came together. There was no standing army. There was no mode of taxation. And these two last things are really central issues, right? There was no unified army to fight either domestically or internationally if there is an issue, and then there is no taxation. So there's no taxation in order to raise revenue to create things that need to be created, and there's no taxation to pay, these piecemeal armies that they're putting together. Both of these are going to become clear weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, and very quickly Federalists begin to come together and say, we need something better. Now, there's one very significant thing that comes out of the period of time in which the United States was unified under the Articles of Confederation. In 1787, the Northwest Ordinance was passed. If you remember that skirmish that set off the French and Indian War that eventually led to the Revolutionary War was over that Ohio country, what would eventually become pieces of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, a large swath of land. After the Revolution, we take that land. And the question is, what is that land going to look like going forward? And this is really going to lay the foundation for many of the divisive things that explode over the next 50 years. Very quickly, what happens is leaders come together, and under the Articles of Confederation, they decide that this Northwest Territory, this large swath of land surrounding the Great Lakes, will do two things. One, it will be cut up into states. So the presupposition is that large swaths of territory, when they come into the United States, will eventually become states themselves. And they lay a groundwork for how this is going to happen. And they say that 60,000 people, when that many people come together, they can apply to statehood and they can become a state. Two, it says that any state that comes out of this piece of land will be a free state. So immediately it lays the groundwork for what it takes to become a state, and it says that there is a large marked off piece of area here in the north where slavery will be prohibited. This is going to lay the groundwork for dissension moving forward. So another very significant event that happens in 1787 under the Articles of Confederation is Shays' Rebellion. And Shays' Rebellion really quickly shows the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Think about what's happening here. Shay was an unpaid Revolutionary War veteran. He's one of thousands of people who had fought for their country, helped create the country, then come home. Because there's no central taxing authority, there's no way to pull together money to pay these people for what they had done during the war. They come back, their homes are foreclosed on, their farms are foreclosed on, there's no way to pay them, there's no way to protect them from the financial damages that have gone on. And because there is no recourse for this, people begin losing their homes. They're foreclosed on, they begin losing their farms. To make matters worse, there's debtors' prisons during this time. So you can actually not just lose your home, but if you're still in debt, you can actually go to jail for it. So you can see that these people were, in the minds of most Americans, Revolutionary War heroes. They were patriots, and they come home and they're unable to financially sustain themselves. And what Shea does is he begins to pull together a large swath of these Revolutionary War veterans and other people that are sympathetic to this, and they begin to cause a domestic uprising. What Shea's rebellion shows is two of the central weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. One, despite their cause, whether it's virtuous, whether it's understandable, this was a domestic uprising, and it could have become very violent. And so the government, under the Articles of Confederation, has to do two things. They have to raise money to pay people to redress this problem, which they can't do. And at the end of the day, when it becomes violent, they have to be able to have an army to come in and squelch a domestic uprising. Unfortunately, things are still in economic chaos, and they actually have to pull in a private militia paid for by merchants to end up putting this rebellion down. The weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation will pave the way for federalism. So let's think about what federalism is for a second. I mentioned before that Federalists had a certain pessimism about democracy. We've already seen that John Adams was pessimistic about this. George Washington wasn't different. Washington quoted here, "We've probably had too good of an opinion of human nature. Experience has taught us that men will not adapt and carry to execution measures the best calculated for their own good without the intervention of coercive power." That's not exactly a pro-democratic argument coming from our first president. This is pretty consistent for a Federalist outlook. Here's a couple of other things if we were to list central ideas of federalism. A weariness of the common people, a commitment to the unified nation, a commitment to a strong central government, a desire to build international trade, domestic infrastructure, and industry. Those are very important because very quickly we're going to see that the Federalists are going to have a very different vision than the Anti-Federalists, not only in the extent of what the federal government should be, but also what the face of the nation should look like. They also believed in centralized banking, and at the end they believed that an aristocracy, or a small group of talented people that led or ruled, is what was needed. George Washington's right-hand man, Alexander Hamilton, is going to push the United States in a very particular direction. He's going to want the creation of a national bank. He's going to want America to become a merchant economy as opposed to an agricultural empire. And he's going to want America to focus on domestic production, which means putting tariff on foreign imports. Now, many people are not going to like the Federalist plan. One, they're not going to want the expansion of a federal government that in their minds could look very much like a new king, even if it was a few people instead of one person. They're also not going to want the merchant economic focus that the Federalists are going to push. There are many people that think agriculture and independence from international trade is a better vision of the future of the nation. Federalists very quickly moved for the passing of a federal constitution. In order to do this, they want to create a strong centralized structure that can oversee the states, that can produce a standing army, that can tax, that can coerce states into doing things they need to, that can put down domestic insurrections, that can defend from international threats, and can engage in international trade. You can see that the big grand vision that they have is very specific. Many people are not going to like this, and so there is a conflict that begins to happen between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists over whether there should be a strong federal government. Anti-Federalists say we just need to tack on a few new things to the Articles of Confederation that will allow taxation and defense. Federalists say we got to start from the ground up and create something that is coherent and consistent and can lay the groundwork for a huge unified nation moving forward. And really good insight into one of the major disagreements that happen is thinking about congressional representation. How should each state be represented? Should they be represented like the Articles of Federation say, one person from one state and just have this blanket equality? Or should larger states have more representation because they have more people? And this becomes a very contentious issue. So what happens is they come to a compromise. We have a bicameral legislature, a House and a Senate. The House is based on population, where the Senate is 2 votes for each state instead of 1. So there's 2 senators that gets represented there. The issue gets more complicated here in the House of Representatives. And this is where we see the great compromise, not just between big states and small states, but between slave states and free states. And if we think about the ways in which racial slavery was enshrined in the founding documents, we can compare the Constitution to the United States Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, where we get these Enlightenment ideas of equality. We get in the Constitution the Great Compromise, where we have racial slavery enshrined in the founding document. It's going to be a clear juxtaposition between the language of Enlightenment thinking in the Declaration. The clearest example of this is the 3/5 clause in the Constitution. The 3/5 clause is a compromise with the slave South that says persons that are not free count as 3/5 of a person when we are counting how many people get represented in Congress. So this means that in the House of Representatives, if you come from a slave state, slaves will count for 3/5 of a person in order to be represented in the House of Representatives. Now, those slaves do not get representation themselves. They are not citizens in the eyes of the United States government. But they are going to allow for slave states to have more people in Congress and therefore more power. The interesting thing here is that the southern states actually wanted those slaves to be counted as one full person. They wanted that because that would have given them even more weight in Congress and more political power nationally. This compromise where slaves would be 3/5 because the Northerners wanted to limit the Southern states' power. The other example is the Fugitive Slave Clause. Here in the Constitution, we have a clause that says if slaves run to the north or outside of a place where slavery is sanctioned as legal, they must be returned. Even with the compromise that happened and the concessions that were made with the slave South, many states were unsure about signing on to the Constitution or ratifying it. So as the Federalists were really pushing for the Constitution to become ratified, a series of papers or essays were published known as the Federalist Papers, in which leading Federalist thinkers like Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison, Federalist policymakers that were really pushing for the Constitution to get passed, began writing these series of essays in order to convince the public to sign off on what many thought was creating a government that could be tyrannical and elite overseeing them, really that could look much like the king that they just had a Revolutionary War to boot. And what they did is they made a series of arguments that said, you might be giving up some liberties. So there might be a federal government that oversees the states, that's able to check the authority of the states or use force when necessary. But what you'll get is something much better in return. You'll get a unified defense from foreign intrusion. You'll get geopolitical advantage where if there is ever any skirmishes with France or England again or anything like that, there could be a much stronger defense system based on this. There will be the ability to control insurrections inside. There would be the ability to engage in monetary exchange or markets, which will provide many more opportunities for success for individual citizens. It will also create unity for people that might be very different. We talked about before how, a farmer in rural Georgia might not be on the same page as a dock worker in Boston or New York. And so the idea here is that this federal contract that brings the nation together will be the foundational law that unifies the nation. It will provide political, economic stability, cultural unity. It will essentially pave the way for a United States. The Federalist Papers were successful, and in 1788, the Constitution of the United States was ratified. Just a couple years later, 1791, we see another insurrection that emerges. So the Whiskey Rebellion is going to emerge out of what a lot of people see as a new tyrannical government. Think about this in the minds of Americans at this point. So very quickly, there is a domestic tax in order to help pay back the Revolutionary War debt. Does that sound familiar? And so these war veterans that fought in the Revolutionary War don't like the idea that they're being taxed by this new government. Whiskey, in particular, becomes a central issue here. Without a unified currency and a strong domestic financial system, whiskey becomes in a sense like currency. Wheat could be distilled into whiskey, and so they would distill it down so it would last longer, and they could use whiskey like money. And so there is this domestic tax on whiskey, and these Americans do not like this. It looks like a new government who's coming in to do the same thing that the old monarchical government came in and did. The difference here, though, is very much unlike Shays' Rebellion. Now there is the ability, A, to produce this tax in order to raise revenue, and then also to have a unified army. And George Washington literally rides in order to squelch this rebellion in a very different situation than under Shays' Rebellion. So after the ratification of the Constitution, there's not really officially an anti-federalist group anymore, but the anti-federalist ideas continue to really permeate the American government. And this begins to divide people who are central in the formation of the early federal government. Those that are sympathetic to the anti-federalists begin to rebrand themselves as Democratic Republicans. I know that can be a little confusing because it's both of our parties, the Democratic and Republican, pushed together. But I think if we look at them compared to the Federalists, it's very easy to see what they believed. If you remember, the Federalists had a very specific view of what America is and should be. They believed that the best people should rule, the most educated, wealthy, elite. They had a hostility towards democracy. They thought that there should be a powerful federal government, even maybe at the expense of states' rights. They believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution. This is important. If the Constitution that they laid forth doesn't necessarily say the federal government can do something, it could be applied that it could. As opposed, we'll see that the Democratic Republicans will have a stricter sense. They really want to foster business, so you can see how the Federalists are going to be concentrated in kind of northeastern capitalistic merchant trading groups. Boston New York becomes very central. They're going to want a protective tariff, so they're going to want to, prize domestic production and focus on exports. They're going to be very pro-British, and this is really going to be a central distinction between Federalists and what we will see Democratic Republicans become. They want an expanding bureaucracy. They want a central bank. They are not very keen on free speech and free press. So if you're critical to the federal government, Federalists are going to see this as a danger to the Union. They want a strong navy in order to protect American shipping. And they are definitely going to focus on merchants, manufacturers, and shipping. In opposition to the Federalists, the Democratic Republicans will believe that a larger group of Americans should have a more say-so in the government, that there should be informed government, but that not just this ruling elite should be the ones that make the decisions, but an informed masses should be able to participate in the democratic political system. They're going to be friendly towards the extension of democracy. They're going to prize the autonomy of the states over the federal government. So it's the states that give the federal government the power, not the federal government that give the states the power. So a very different interpretation there. They're also going to have a stricter interpretation of the Constitution. If the Constitution doesn't say the federal government can do something, it can't do it. There's no loose interpretation that would allow the federal government to do things that it doesn't specifically say that it can do. They don't believe in any special favors to business. They think that agriculture is the best way forward. Not going to initially be big on protective tariffs to give favors to merchants or manufacturers. They're not going to be very big on a long, close relationship with England. They're going to want to break with England. They're actually going to be more pro-French, more revolutionary. They want to make sure that the federal government stays small and it doesn't become too large or big, tyrannical, strong. They're going to want to encourage state banks and not a large federal bank. They're going to be very supportive of free speech and free press. They're largely concentrated into the South and Southwest, which we'll see as we move forward. They're going to want to strip down Navy and Army because large standing armies can be a threat to the people in their minds. There's this large concentration, not like the Federalists in merchant economies, but more in agriculture and farming centers. So if Washington and Hamilton and Adams are really good examples of Federalists who have that Federalist vision for the United States, Thomas Jefferson will be the central figure for the Democratic Republicans. So much that Democratic Republicanism essentially becomes named Jeffersonian Republicanism as we begin to move forward. Thomas Jefferson ends up holding almost every office you can. He's governor of Virginia. He becomes Secretary of State, the diplomat to France. he becomes vice president, and then eventually he'll become president. Unlike the Federalists, who will focus on large global merchant economies, Thomas Jefferson believed the best way forward is to focus on agriculture. In his own words, agriculture is our wisest pursuit because it will in the end contribute the most to real wealth, good morals, and happiness. But he advocated for these independent farms while simultaneously building them on the back of racial slavery. Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner himself, owning over 400 people during his life. He also fathered many children with his slave Sally Hemings. So the paradox or inconsistencies, the contradiction of the Americas that will begin to move forward in the early republic is very clear, maybe clearest in Thomas Jefferson. We shouldn't forget that the agricultural ideal that he often preached, this idea that American citizens should be independent farmers, and that the production, the hard work that goes into that agricultural endeavor creates a inherent virtue or goodness in people, was simultaneously built on the backs of black slaves. In 1796, the Federalists and the Antifederalists went head-to-head. John Adams, the leading Federalist, goes head-to-head with Thomas Jefferson, the leading Democratic Republican or Jeffersonian Republican. All the while, George Washington was arguing for unity in government. Because at the time, whoever got the second number of votes become vice president. Think about that now. Think about if when Donald Trump won in 2016, Hillary Clinton came in second, she would have been the vice president. Obviously, this is not the best way to go about things, but this is the way things were in the early elections. This gets remedied quick under Jefferson's presidency, where they fixed this. But at the time, the leading Federalist becomes president, the leading Anti-Federalist becomes vice president. And very quickly, this becomes extremely problematic. To make matters worse, in 1798, 2 years later, we almost go to war with France. We send diplomats over to France to try to establish peace. And when we do this, they're met with a request for a bribe and then a loan. And so Federalists get really mad about this. Why this is important is because we begin building up our army, we begin to start taking French ships, things come to a real head. But here on the home front, things become even more problematic for everyday citizens. They pass these Alien and Sedition Acts in 1787. The Alien and Sedition Acts stop immigration. They let the president expel or imprison anybody suspected of being dangerous aliens, without defining the charges. Now, this is really tough because the Federalists just passed a constitution, and one of the things that the American public was worried about is Federalists getting in charge and becoming tyrannical like the monarchical government that they just threw off when they had a revolutionary war against England. And it looks like this is what's happening. They essentially say that the president can push people out of the nation, can jail people that perhaps are dangerous without defining charges, and then also that you can fine and imprison anyone that's speaking out against the government. You're essentially suppressing honest opinion, free speech, freedom of the press. Just after the Constitution, we passed the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, freedom of press, freedom of speech. And it looks like the federal government is compromising the things that we had just agreed on as a nation that they wouldn't do. Immediately, Thomas Jefferson begins working with local governments in Virginia and Kentucky, and he begins to push for a rejection of the Alien and Sedition Acts. And this is really significant because you have the Vice President of the United States doing something that is, according to the President of the United States, illegal. What Jefferson's going to do is he's going to work with Kentucky and Virginia to pass the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And what he's going to argue is that whenever the Federalist government or any government begins to pass laws that are unjust or tyrannical or against the citizens or the autonomy of the states, that the states in the Union have the ability to nullify or ignore those laws. This idea of nullification becomes extremely central in the first 50 years of the United States, because what it does is it lays the groundwork for the argument that if the states or any number of citizens believe a law to be unjust, then they can nullify it or ignore it. You can see how this will lay the groundwork for a states' rights argument for secession from the Union. Jefferson's pushback against the Alien Sedition Acts will make him wildly popular politically. The Democratic Republicans very quickly become the party of freedom. And this is right at this point because they are pushing back against what is clearly an abuse of Federalist power. In 1800, when there is another presidential election, Thomas Jefferson is going to win. Many will remember this as the Jeffersonian Revolution of 1800. The significance of the Revolution of 1800 is not so much that there is a complete policy change, although we'll see that there is some changes that happen. What is really significant is it sets the pace in the American mind for what a peaceful transition of power is. You have two inherently opposed parties, Federalists and what are essentially Anti-Federalists, the Democratic Republicans. They are small federal government people who are going to be at odds on almost all issues. And when they are voted in, there is not violence that ensues, but a peaceful transition of power. This is going to set the pace for future elections, for the ethos, for the expectation of the American people. Why the January 6th failure of a peaceful transition of power is seen as un-American.